Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola. I'm the host of this channel, a journalist, and the editor of the Dissenter newsletter. Apologize for starting just a few minutes later than usual, but here we are, and let's get rolling. I have several things to cover on this live stream. I welcome all of you who are tuning in. I'll go over, I was denied access to the upcoming Assange hearing, the hearing in Julian Assange's extradition case that is scheduled for May 20th. And I'll get into why the court is denying international journalists access to proceedings. David McBride, an Australian whistleblower who exposed war crimes in the Afghanistan war, was sentenced to prison. This is both a issue of being part of the war on whistleblowers globally, as well as part of attacks on media freedom. So I'll highlight that. And I had the opportunity to interview David on one occasion. I might play a little bit of that prior interview. There's this story around a secret recording that Idaho State Police warned a media outlet that publishing the story about a secret recording might violate Idaho law. We have another peculiar example of attacks on freedom of the press in a local setting in the US. We keep having these examples of attacks. There was the raid on a community newspaper in Kansas. There continue to be these types of incidents that I think are reflective of a degraded press freedom at the top, on a national level. That I don't think that the Justice Department is doing an effective job of ensuring that these local areas do not commit these attacks, that these state police, other institutions are able to get away with these attacks. There's the report, what was known as the NSM 20, but this is the report that you may have seen covered on weapons to Israel from the United States and how they've been used in war crimes or violations of international humanitarian law. The conclusion in the report is a sham. I'll get to some of that. I have to discuss that, particularly in the context of the fact that there must be whistleblowers who can come forward and tell us how this report was altered or finessed in order to fit the narrative that is coming out of the U.S. government around continued support for Israel's assault on Gaza. And then my colleague, as well as a friend, Rania Kalik. I've hosted Unauthorized Disclosure, the weekly podcast with her for over 10 years. She was on Piers Morgan Uncensored. And I want to play a clip to show you all how she was treated. And in particular, this last 5 minutes of going on Piers was remarkable. So thank you. That just gives you a bit of a rundown for what you can expect, and appreciate the humor. Waiting for Gazdo. It's good. I am here now and ready to deliver what I promise on this channel. And so just before I get rolling, people who subscribe to the newsletter, I encourage you to do so to get the regular updates on Julian Assange's case that are posted, to get coverage of press freedom stories as well as whistleblower stories that are of importance. I'll be doing something more substantial on David McBride's sentencing after I finish with this broadcast. And then I would also say, please donate. And I'll get to why, in particular, I'm making a call for donations. It's in the context of being denied access to the Assange proceedings. But donate if you support this independent journalism and if you support what the channel is trying to do and the focus of my attention. If you support producing videos and calling attention to these stories, chip in a few dollars. To here, don't give me a super chat that goes through Google and then I only get just a little bit of a cut and I don't know when I'll see it. I'm not quite sure when those transactions get processed. Donate here, and then whatever you give will make this journalism on freedom of the press and the war on whistleblowers and other issues of national security and foreign policy importance possible, covering those global issues. So, as I say, I don't know how many people here are familiar with what I do. I am the author of Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange. I'm one of the only American journalists who have covered this case in its entirety, made an effort to be present, whether it's remotely or physically in the courtroom. If I am not able to be there, I have hired reporters. I've hired Mohammed Almazi, who is based in London, to cover the proceedings for the dissenter. My intention is to try and cover this myself unless I am denied access. So once again, the British High Court of Justice has denied access to me and any international journalist who cannot be based in, who cannot get to England or Wales. And why specifically England or Wales? The reason is because the court says that it cannot enforce the court's regulations and rules. The rules that the court expects everyone to follow, which involve not taking video, not taking screenshots of the video link. I specifically asked for video link access so that I could cover the proceedings remotely, as I have done a number of times in covering Julian Assange's extradition case. They do not want to credential international reporters who are based outside of England and Wales. And so that means that you can't get credentials if you're in Northern Ireland. It means that you cannot get credentials if you're in Scotland because they have another legal system. So then the court is unable to hold somebody in contempt and penalize them. You put them in jail should they violate the court's rules. So all this comes down to, and I think it is an affront to journalism that this is the court's position. It's only become the court's position as we near the final stage of Julian Assange's ability to even bring forth a legal challenge in the UK court. So this very well could be the last hearing in a UK court. But the court has taken a position, which I believe is an affront to journalism, that all international journalists, including myself, no matter whether the court can verify their identity or if they can look at the track record of following rules, it doesn't matter. It is presumed that an international journalist will break the rules that are set by the court. And so they have to have the ability to hold me in contempt and jail me if I don't follow the court's rules, if I don't adhere to His Majesty's rules for the High Court of Justice. And so that is why I've been denied access. And they can make all kinds of claims about how they're upholding open justice. I don't even know what that means anymore. I have no idea what that phrase means because they've essentially set up this kind of status quo where basically anybody who is outside of England or Wales can be denied access just on the basis that there is a journalist from their country who will be present to follow the proceedings. So, in other words, I was told that they do not need to accommodate me because there will still be American journalists that are covering. So there are American journalists that are going to be in England or Wales to cover it remotely, or that they will be going to the Royal Courts of Justice to cover Julian Assange's extradition hearing on May 20th. And we're not even talking about what it is that the hearing will go over, because the issue right now is that they are denying international journalists access. There are people who are part of the union in which Julian Assange is a member, the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance, that would like to be able to cover this remotely. They are expected to travel thousands upon thousands of kilometers to get to the UK. And then when they park themselves in some hotel in England or Wales, even if they aren't able to get to the court, maybe they don't get a seat in court, it's okay. They will be granted remote access and they can watch the video link, because those Australians now could be punished by the court if they violate the rules. This is what the court wants to be normal. The idea that us media people are not going to listen to court officers and do what is expected of us, that we are a threat to security of the court. So I'm left in this position where, in order for me to do the job that I've been performing through the dissenter, I have to fund a reporter. We have to hire a reporter. So I ask you, if you have listened to what I've said and you're moved and so inclined, to chip in a few dollars so I can hire yet again a reporter. I've had to do this last time, but again, it looks like I will have to hire a reporter who is based in London or can be in the jurisdiction of England and Wales, and that reporter will go to the hearing or will follow the proceeding remotely. They'll submit a report. I'll edit that report, and I'll make sure that people who follow the Dissenter newsletter or subscribers to it will get coverage of Julian Assange's extradition case. And it won't be able to be myself reporting, because I have been denied access inappropriately, in my opinion, on this claim that it is not in the interests of open justice for me to be given a video link so that I can follow the proceedings from the United States. I do not know that anybody outside of England or Wales was granted a video link, but if there are any journalists out there, feel free to reach out to me. I am interested in learning if there are individuals out there who are media that are not going to be in England or Wales and will be able to report on the proceedings and do their job. I don't know how many viewers of this channel want to listen to me go on and on about obstacles to completing my work as a professional, but I do think that this is in the interests of, this goes to the issue of this case being of importance to global press freedom. It's not an accident that the court views journalists as threats to security in a case in which the United States is going through a prosecution service in the UK to try and extradite Julian Assange for supposedly jeopardizing national security when he published classified information on the WikiLeaks website. And the work that he did, and the criminalization of journalism in this case. I don't believe it's an accident that we, the people who are going to go cover and report on these proceedings, are also treated as some kind of threat to court proceedings, that we would not do what is expected. And I don't even think it's worth sharing. Honestly, it's pretty ridiculous that they think that I'm going to take a screenshot of their grainy little footage that they stream. They don't really spend money on the technology anyway, and sometimes you can't even hear the audio from the courtroom. It can be a bit cumbersome. Obviously, the preference would be to go to those proceedings and be in court, but that's not actually easy either to be in court. I wrote about the media access issues that the Royal Courts of Justice were plagued with back in February. You have people who go there, they get seats, they're told that they have to leave because there are other reporters that are from more prestigious organizations that are supposed to have those seats. You have people who travel from different parts of Europe to cover, or from the US, or I don't know, other parts of the world. They come and then they get put in the public gallery, which is not really where the press is supposed to be, but it's an overflow space. They get put in rooms and um, that are like darkly lit, or they're seated far away from a tiny television that they then can basically watch the proceedings through a monitor. And it's difficult to, again, do your job and follow what is happening in the proceedings. This is being held in a courthouse that is not very modern. It's an, I don't think it was built, I believe, well over 100 years ago, if not a couple hundred years ago. They do not have the equipment or the technology to facilitate the kind of overflow access that you would come to expect if you're doing this as a reporter. And so they're deceitful. I think it's deceitful the way that the court administrative office strings along international journalists. I was offered the opportunity to give my reasons for why it was in the interests of open justice to get access. Meanwhile, the court's position, and it was going to be the court's position, I'm to be denied because I am not in England or Wales, and so they cannot punish me if I violate the rules. So why even invite international journalists to apply for access and make a case that they should be granted access because it's in the interests of open justice? Nobody likes to have their time wasted, least of all the people who are trying to manage a court. So next time, why not just come out and say, don't apply for access unless you're going to be in England or Wales? Because they have to make some kind of like pretense that they are open to having media come cover these proceedings. This is a high profile case, and they should be doing everything that they can to accommodate people who are interested in following it. The denial of people who are not in, the denial of access to international journalists who cannot travel to England or Wales, either because they have personal circumstances or professional circumstances that get in the way. I mean, it's a one-day hearing. If this was several days, we would be having a different conversation. Perhaps I pay the money for a ticket, get my ass on the plane and fly to London and spend a week in London covering this. The hearing that we're going to have over US assurances, the empty promises about how they'll treat Assange, is going to be maybe an hour and a half, 2.5 hours, and then it's over. And then it'll be time to board a plane and get back home. It's silly. It is a waste of money and resources and energy. And if you can accommodate people from around the world following this high profile case, that should be what the courts do in London. Needless to say, there are courts in the United States that I believe might handle this differently. Might not be taking this kind of 19th century approach to media access in a building that has very limited space to seat journalists, despite what the administrators might claim. So I'm here, and I'm going to continue to follow what happens with Julian Assange. But for this particular hearing, hour and a half, 2 hours, I'll have to depend on somebody that we hire. So again, if you can chip in a few dollars, this is the donate link. It's the dissenter.org/donate. And there you can help me bring aboard someone who can help the dissenter overcome this denial of access. Moving on. So the next thing to discuss here, well, I'll just check in with all of you before. And thank you for tuning in. And I'm so glad that you're engaged and following. I'll come back to some of your comments at the end of the broadcast. So go ahead and continue to leave them. It's always good to see people who are engaged with the broadcast. All right, so David McBride, I mentioned, Australian whistleblower. Let me put this up here. This is a report out from the Associated Press, but I could go to several dozen outlets who have stories about the sentencing today. I'll just go here for a very basic report on what happened with David McBride. So there he is. That's David, and he's known to have exposed Australian war crimes in Afghanistan. These are war crimes that were actually investigated by the Australian government. They put together a report, and the report was compiled on the pretense that there could be criminal prosecutions based upon evidence collected on the way that Australian soldiers in particular units had committed atrocities. But he's going to prison. He's going to go to prison for the release of classified information. Here, if I scroll down, I'll go ahead and come back. The report says that the judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison. So 6 years, almost 6 years in prison. He's a 60-year-old. 5 years and 8 months in prison after he pled guilty to 3 charges. By the way, he pled guilty to those 3 charges related to mishandling of classified information because there was evidence that could not be raised during his trial. I believe it was assessed that there was a kind of infringement on his ability to have his due process rights respected during the proceedings. And so rather than go through it hamstrung, as happens with whistleblowers under Espionage Act prosecution in the United States, he pled guilty. And he was facing a threat of a life sentence. The judge, Justice David Mossop, ordered David McBride to serve 27 months in prison before he can be considered for release on parole. So he will have to serve a little more than 2 years in prison before he can be released. The other thing, so his lawyer, the lawyer for McBride, said his legal team will appeal the ruling that prevented McBride from mounting a defense, right? So there was a judge made a ruling in court that blocked him from making a defense, so they did not take the case to trial. Essentially, Mossop ruled in November that McBride had no duty as an Army officer beyond following orders. And Mark Davis, McBride's lawyer, says, "We know that the Australian military teach a much broader notion of what the duty of an officer is in a battlefield than to follow orders." He also said that the severity of the sentence created grounds for appeal, but their effort would focus on the earlier rulings. McBride's documents, according to the AP, form the basis of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's 7-part television series in 2017 that contained war crimes allegations, including Australian Special Air Service Regiment soldiers who killed unarmed Afghan men and children in 2013. And of course, there's a media freedom aspect to this. In 2019, the police in Australia raided the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's headquarters in Sydney because they were looking for evidence of a leak. And then they decided not to charge 2 reporters that were involved in doing this series, doing this 7-part television series on Australian war crimes. It's incredible. This is where we are. This is, by the way, I think you would all agree, incongruent. Oh, Yeah, why don't I do that? Good idea. This is the report. I'm doing as Gregory suggests. It's a good suggestion. You just listen to me talk and speak about this article. I'm going to drop this here. It's now on the post. And you're all welcome to go get a fuller picture. It's a pretty good summary of the sentencing. I also want to reference what came from the Media, Entertainment, and Arts Alliance on this. And again, as I said, this is the union that Julian Assange is a member. And they call this a shameful day for Australia's justice system. Media freedom is under threat in this country, and governments at all levels must commit to protecting whistleblowers and journalists. The public has a right to know what its governments are doing. Without whistleblowers and journalists, corruption can flourish. A mature democracy does not shy away from scrutiny. It is time our political leaders truly embrace transparency and accountability. So the campaign to free Julian Assange, which David McBride was a big supporter, has lost an advocate that could be out there speaking for Julian Assange. So there is that. But the government has come to the side of Julian Assange and have been pushing for his release from prison and an end to this case. And meanwhile, they're doing this. They have jailed a whistleblower, and they have jailed a whistleblower who was denied the ability to put on a defense against the charges brought against him. And not only that, the prosecutor in Australia did not drop the charges that involved allegations of war crimes. The information released that was classified involved Australian war crimes. It is not disputed. It is accepted as truth that's what was contained. And they could decide not to prosecute because there's an obligation for that kind of information to see the light of day, to be available for the public, and that those in the Australian government have an obligation to act upon such evidence and bring people to trial for human rights abuses. Not the case, though. They continued. They did not back down. They put David McBride in jail for being a whistleblower. All right, so that's David McBride, and I mentioned that there's I did this interview a while ago. Make use of the chat again. This is a link to the previous interview that I did. It was for unauthorized disclosure. There's plenty for me to cover today, so I'm not going to continue forward and play a clip. I'll come back and maybe do some more on this as it develops. You know, if there's an appeal, it'll be worth it to refer back to David McBride's interview with me and make sure everybody knows some more details about. I haven't talked about this case as much as I probably should. Other stories have occupied my attention, that being a dad. So continuing to the sham report that we have out from the State Department, which was supposed to document the U.S. weapons and how Israel has used those weapons in the war on Gaza. And it makes some admissions. It does conclude what we all know to be true, that these weapons have been used for human rights abuses. But what it doesn't say is that there are any actions which the U.S. government must take in order to stop Israel from further committing atrocities. So I believe that I believe that there are whistleblowers that can come forward and tell us what happened in the last week, because this was a date on the calendar, and I believe that all this information was submitted, and the people who were doing the diligence that they must to complete this report, which was part of a a congressional uh, process. So they have to submit this report to Congress, and it gives a little bit of a layer of oversight. Under what's known as the Leahy Law, it is a law that says that if the US government knows that military units or people working for the government are using weapons and military equipment for human rights abuses, then they have to stop providing that support. Those arms, that military equipment would have to be cut off, no longer sent to those people. And so in this instance, uh, you know, they submit this report. It's kind of the first of its kind under this national security memorandum, and then they're going to have annual reports. The report has a section on Israel. There's also other countries that the U.S. arms, which are part of this report, but the focus is on Israel, understandably, because we see this Rafah military operation ramping up, and everyone is understandably dreading the bloodshed that is coming, and also the killings that have been happening of civilians, and families being attacked, apartments being flattened over the last and then people in tents being attacked over the last week. So you have in this report, and first let me just get to someone who has some credibility on this. It's Chris Van Hollen, who is a senator from Maryland, who was not happy with the report because it was supposed to be a bit of an accountability mechanism, and it was meant to track the compliance with international humanitarian law and the best practices for civilian harm reduction and the standards for facilitating the delivery of U.S. supported humanitarian assistance. And the intent of the report was not just to look at the facts on the ground today, but to provide an unvarnished account of the facts and the law since January 2023, including the full period of the war in Gaza. While the report acknowledges that it is reasonable to assess that defense articles covered under the National Security Memorandum have been used by Israeli security forces since October 7th in instances inconsistent with international humanitarian law obligations or with established best practices for mitigating civilian harm. It's a lot of gobbledygook, but basically accepting that people have been killed with U.S. weapons who should not have. Van Hollen said it largely fails to meet the mark of what was required. According to the National Security Memorandum, this report had 3 areas to investigate. Whether recipient countries use U.S. weapons in line with international law, whether if they follow established practices to limit civilian harm, and whether they fully cooperate with U.S.-supported efforts to deliver humanitarian aid. The report requires a full accounting of each of these measures from day one of the conflict to now. And then he goes on and says that the administration created a tool to promote accountability, but has come up very short in its implementation. When it comes to applying international law and human rights, you can't cherry pick the facts in the law. Today's report also indicates a continuation of a disturbing pattern where the expertise and analyses of those working most closely on these issues at the State Department and at USAID have been swept aside to facilitate a predetermined policy outcome based on political convenience. And so he's saying what I suspect, which is that the people who were career State Department employees that are working on this, the report is basically taken out of their hands and then it's doctored, and people at the State Department, from Secretary of State Antony Blinken on down, change it to fit the narrative that they want to promote around the war on Gaza and Israel. And so that's why we get, if I can read the part about it and some of the more astounding aspects of it. Again, I realized that this was reported last week, and it may be old news to you at this point. Everything moves pretty quickly in the war. And since it was put out, this report, there's at least a few dozen more Palestinians who have been killed. But this was part of a Friday news dump in an effort to get away from having to face scrutiny. So to come back on Monday and even Tuesday, we still have to attend to what is in this report and how they try to exonerate Israel. So I think what's best, before I highlight some specific parts of this report, let's play the clip of the State Department spokesperson. It's Verdant Patel. You're not going to get Smirkula or Matthew Miller, who always seems to have this like sarcastic grin on his face as he's being questioned about U.S. policy on the war on Gaza. And it, this is a different guy, and actually, I think he's a better face, and he has much better demeanor when it comes to tackling these questions. But let me open this up, and we'll play. The reporter is asked about this sham report, and here is the State Department addressing.
In it, the State Department says it's
the State Department is addressing what it thinks about how this report was put together, and why they think we should accept it as satisfactory, and probably no longer question U.S. government support for Israel's war.
In it, the State Department says it's reasonable to assess that there could be violations, but of course saying not that there's no evidence of it. If it's reasonable to assess that there are violations, how does this affect the State Department planning going forward? Should there be greater concern, greater restrictions potentially on weapons going forward?
So there's no policy change to announce, Sean. What the report makes clear is that first, to take a little bit of a step back, the report makes clear that this is a very complex and complicated battlefield. It is a very dense and urban setting. We are also dealing with a belligerent, in this case Hamas, that has a clear track record and history of co-locating itself with civilians and civilian infrastructure, using civilians as human shields.
I'm doing the thing that I do when I come back from a video clip. And so let everybody catch up with me. Why don't I pause so I know that everybody's there with me? The feed will catch up, and you'll be there with me. And eventually, people will stop telling me that they can't hear me, and they'll be there with me. And I can say I'm sorry, and I can figure this all out and do it the right way. And I should pay more attention to the chat so that you can let me know how to do this. So, all right. Anyways, what I was saying was that Verdant Patel, I thank him for regurgitating the part of the report that justifies Israel's genocidal violence, because the argument that he's making there is essentially that even though Israel has committed these war crimes, that well, they're fighting a Hamas group that is difficult to battle, since they're known to hide among the civilian population. At least that's the narrative that is fed to us. So there's two ways of addressing that, which is the first to say, give us some evidence, give us something that proves that these operations are, that someone's firing rockets from within refugee camps or from aid facilities, or that these hospitals are really where war is being waged. That this is where Hamas is returning fire from Israel. They just don't. They just don't feel they have to demonstrate it because they have this canard from 10 to 15 years and before it that they keep running with. And you can look this up, that there isn't a lot of evidence out there that Hamas does this thing with human shields. But we do have video of Israeli military forces using Palestinians as human shields. There will never be a press briefing where the State Department condemns that. There are people who are captives, and they are marched, and they're in the middle of fire that is coming from resistance military forces. And so something is, we'll get to this in the clip that I have prepared coming up from Piers Morgan's show. What you got to recognize here is that this is an open air prison. These are stateless people. They are handled in such a way by the Israeli government that they are deprived through a blockade of getting the basic human needs. They don't get the medicine or the food or the construction equipment, construction materials. And so you see that the things that we take for granted in the United States or people in Western European countries and other parts of the world, well, they don't have those things, those materials. So it's much different life for Palestinians. And then also the fact that the Israeli military and security forces can always come in there. They can arrest anybody. There's no freedom of movement. They don't really have the freedom to pick their own leaders, except the ones that Netanyahu wants to prop up so that he can convince the world that Palestine is a terrorist state. And then those groups that are resisting this oppression, the violence that is perpetrated against them by Israeli military forces, those people fighting back are seen as terrorists. They're not seen as militants who are fighting as part of a war. They're not seen as people who are responding to a military force. They're seen as militant terrorists who should be rounded up and either killed or should be jailed. So this is missing in the State Department's discussion of the issue, that there isn't an equality here. The monopoly of force is entirely in the hands of the Israeli government. So it's up to them to not murder children. It's up to them to not maim women. It's up to them to not rape them, which we know Israeli soldiers have been doing. We know they've been using sexual assault and other degrading tactics to humiliate people who they have captured. This time, I won't mute.
We've also made clear in the report that the IDF has undertaken steps to implement international humanitarian law obligations for the protections of civilians in the current conflict, including requirements that are related to distinction, proportionality, and others. But we also are clear in our report that it's reasonable to assess that defense articles covered under the National Security Memorandum have been used by Israeli security forces in instances that are inconsistent with its IHL obligations. But we also have no direct indication of Israel intentionally targeting civilians. But to take a step back, Sean, and I guess this addresses kind of your broader question, a country's overall commitment to international humanitarian law is not necessarily disproven by what may be individual IHL violations. And the most important thing here is that Israel does not. Israel does have a number of ongoing active criminal investigations pending, and there are hundreds of other cases under administrative review. Israel has taken steps to and is taking steps to hold itself and its actions accountable. Simultaneously, we also continue to have tools at our disposal that existed before the National Security Memorandum and existed afterwards. Things like the Churg process, the Leahy process, the conventional arms transfer policy, end use monitoring, and other things to continue to assess and continue to look into instances that are reported to us that may be concerning. The same is can be said about humanitarian aid. We continue to monitor that situation very closely.
So I just don't think that that's how it's supposed to work or was envisioned when Congress stepped in and created this idea or this procedure that says, all right, so the US is an empire and it's going to send its weapons to different countries and provide aid. And it's going to get involved in regional conflicts. It's going to take sides. It's going to help certain countries. And because the United States wants to put on this show that it supports human rights and democracy, well, it's important that we make sure that the weapons that are being sent to military units don't go to the worst of the worst. Don't go to units that are engaging in torture, systematic torture, that are accused of mass killings, genocide. I guess probably employing child soldiers, etc. Just to make sure that and yeah, thank you, Kathy. There's at this moment, to my discredit, there's always something that we could be covering in the Congo or even Sudan is a country where we should probably be paying closer attention just as much as we are to the health and lack of safety or the lack of health for Palestinians. But the idea was that these weapons that are shipped to these countries, you would be able to track those weapons. If you find evidence that they're being used to commit war crimes, then that's it. That unit is supposed to be shut off to being able to access the weapons. And that's, you take, like, let's say it's Unit 753 in Israel, and you'd go to the government and you'd say, we are still sending you 2,000-pound bombs. But if you let this unit touch the 2,000-pound bombs that we have sent you, then there will be more consequences. We will have to restrict access to more of this military supply that we are sharing with you. And so, given that, it's just incredible to listen to the State Department spokes, the paid liar. He's a paid liar, so what do I expect? This is the narrative. This is what Secretary of State Antony Blinken wants to maintain as the position of the United States. But it is incredible that he can stand up there and say things like, well, because they are investigating themselves and because we've assessed that they do have policies for human rights, that then the commission of these atrocities are not a good enough reason to stop sending them weapons because they do pretend to care about human rights. I mean, that's basically what he's saying. Like, even though there's evidence that war crimes have been committed, here's a country that does have legal bodies that will investigate soldiers and if they've committed torture or if they're committing atrocities. That's true in the I would say it's true for a lot of countries. It doesn't mean that you accept it. I mean, like Russia probably has courts that are capable of reviewing the conduct of their soldiers. But that doesn't prevent the U.S. from saying that there should be sanctions against Russia. It's really bizarre. And then, I believe the spokes was going to get to the humanitarian aid. I mean, the conclusion that the Israeli government isn't obstructing aid is like right out of the kind of playbook that the U.S. has for using proxies to facilitate actions that they don't want to defend. We see settlers that are setting aid on fire. And does anybody believe that that would be happening if the Israeli government didn't consent to it in some manner? I mean, and they've been telling the Israeli government that they have to do more to stop settlers from stopping this aid and destroying it, and they're just not moved to make sure that Palestinians are fed through these resources, through these food that's being donated. Pause for a moment and just say thank you to those who have donated. And here it is, thedissenter.org/donate. If at any time in this broadcast you're moved by what I've said. But again, going back to the beginning and what you're saying here, Kathy, that I asked for donations because I was blocked from access to Julian Assange's hearing, and we have to hire a reporter. Going back to the final things on the sham report on U.S. weapons to Israel. As I say, they add all this narrative to a report that's supposed to be just about attacks. And they add this language about Israel having a right to defend itself in the wake of October 7th, and then that the are not only being provided to attack Palestinians, but as also to counter Iran, Hezbollah, and other Iranian-backed proxies. And that, they're not just providing this and looking the other way when Israel gets these weapons. They maintain, the U.S. government does, that they are constantly asking Israel to protect humanitarian workers, adhere to international humanitarian law, facilitate the flow of humanitarian aid, and minimize civilian casualties. But I don't think the U.S. government can point to anything provable on how casualties are being minimized. And we saw something from, I believe it was 972 mag, that like the acceptable ratio is basically somewhere around like 300 civilians can die if one Hamas militant is killed. Amnesty International submitted their own documentation of how U.S. weapons provided to Israel are killing civilians, and they actually went before October 7th. That's a nice convenient date for Biden and all the people in the U.S. government and everyone who is in Congress who thinks that the U.S. should do whatever Israel asks of the United States. So much for freedom and independence. But in May 2023, there were 11 civilians killed, and that was by Boeing. They were JDAMs and SDBs. That's what it says. That there were weapons provided by Boeing that were used, and that these involve precision-guided bombs, so-called precision-guided bombs that were used to go after Al-Quds brigades and people in there. And then they get to October, there's 43 civilians killed. And again, we're still not at October 7th, but October 4th, there was also white phosphorus that was deployed, 9 civilians killed. This was submitted to the State Department for inclusion in the report. There's in December 23 and 2024, 95 civilians killed. And they were killed by Boeing weaponry. weaponry from Boeing, which I think they do a little bit better job of making than their airplanes. So they don't have to kill anybody, and nobody's blowing the whistle on weapons that are shipped to Israel. All right, so there you go. That was the sham report. That's a section I wanted to do covering the sham report. And coming up towards the end of the week, if you're a subscriber to the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, I have some guests that I'll have on to discuss that report and some actions on DC, on Capitol Hill in DC to challenge U.S. policy. I also must recommend that you go to the Belly of the Beast and watch their documentaries that they have coming out. I interviewed Liz Oliva Fernandez about the U.S. policy towards Cuba, which Joe Biden has embraced this war, economic war on Cuba that was re-upped by President Donald Trump. There was a relaxing of restrictions. There was travel that was allowed. President Obama, say what you will about him, but someone in his administration, maybe even Obama himself, thought, I think that it would be okay if people from Cuba and the U.S. got to meet each other, and there were people in the U.S. who wanted to travel to Cuba. Let's allow Cuba to be opened up for business. And then Trump returned the policy to its right-wing anti-communist basis that it had been steeped in for decades. Joe Biden's allowed that to continue, and it strangles the population in Cuba. And so there's a couple documentaries, one on Biden's policy, and then one on corrupt U.S. Senator Robert Menendez, gold bars Menendez, and his bribery, and he's on trial now, but he's also the leading influential senator that keeps policy from being sane towards Cuba. They're at Belly of the Beast. If you go to YouTube, Belly of the Beast, why don't I go ahead and grab the link to their latest documentary and do that right now. This is Hardliner on the Hudson that they have posted. It is available. Just have to pull it up here. And they do some really excellent work, I think. And Liz Oliva Fernandez was a great presenter. So you all should take a chance to tune into this if I can find it. Here it is. This is what I wanted to show you. I watched this documentary and I thought they did a pretty good job. So there you go. I posted that documentary into the chat. And the last thing for this broadcast that I wanted to get to is my colleague Rania Khalek on Piers Morgan. That doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you who may not know, I have collaborated on this podcast with Rania Khalek. Rania is at Breakthrough News. She does some incredible interviews that she posts there as part of her Dispatches show. And she is someone with expertise she's a Lebanese American. She's based in Beirut. And she ended up on this broadcast. I'm going to ignore the people who she had to share airtime with because they're irrelevant to this clip that I'm going to show. But one of them was out and out Zionist whose preoccupation is Iran being behind everything. It's kind of like a version of believing that the communists are behind everything. For her, there's an Iran proxy, or there's a sinister Iranian force behind everything. So she was insufferable. But this clip that I want to show you is at the end here. They've had 35 minutes or so of conversation, and some basic points were made by Rania, and others got a chance to respond to them. And Piers has done his bullshit line of questioning. He's done his gotcha question about Rania, would you condemn the Hamas attack on October 7th? This thing that he can't get off. He does this to every single guest that is on his show, even though it's largely irrelevant to having just a conversation about the lay of the land right now, what is happening in Gaza. And so then he does this while they are, well, he actually comes back and asks her again, would you like another opportunity to condemn Hamas, which leads to this gem of an exchange.
I believe it. I believe what happened on October 7th was a reaction to Israeli
Was
terrorism.
it justified?
That's what I believe. I'm not going to sit here and play a game about whether it was justified or not. That is not my place to talk about.
It was a terror attack.
I am here.
Do you believe it was
justified? No, it is a game you're playing. It's a distraction.
Was it justified?
You are trying to distract from
Why
an
don't you just answer the
ongoing
question?
genocide. You are trying to
Answer the
distract from an
question.
ongoing genocide, because I'm not playing that game.
It's not a game.
Not my place to tell oppressed people what they... It's not my place to
So
justify
you now say
or
they are
unjustify
oppressed
something.
people. Okay.
Rania, I don't understand.
Okay, now
Yes.
hang on, Emily.
Hamas is
Emily, don't
oppressing
interrupt,
Palestinian
please.
people. Why would
Emily,
you side with them?
let me finish. So, okay, so they're oppressed
You
people.
are justifying a genocide.
Sorry,
there is a
Rania,
genocide of Palestinians
you just
happening in Gaza
Rania,
right now.
You just
That
said,
is what I am here to talk about.
You just said they were oppressed people, which is what I said at the start. So do you believe that Hamas leaders are billionaires or not?
There's some Hamas leaders who have money. I don't
they-
know what
are
that
they
has to do with
billionaires?
the genocide in Gaza.
Are they billionaires?
I don't know why you're why is this the conversation? It's
where do they
crazy to me.
live?
There are like children being bombed
Where
right
do
now
they
by
live?
Israel.
Where do they
with
live?
bombs supplied by my government.
Where do the Hamas billionaires live? The guys that run
Here's
Hamas.
where, I don't even understand. I really have no idea where you're going
You
with
don't
this.
care,
I actually
do you?
don't know if there's a Hamas billionaire. I don't know if there's a Hamas billionaire, Piers. I just know that what you're doing right now is trying to distract from a genocide that Israel
Actually,
is carrying out.
all I'm doing actually,
Yes, actually, yes.
yeah, all I'm actually doing is asking you very simple questions, and your failure to answer them is very illuminating.
My failure to answer if there's rich members of Hamas, what does that have to do with the genocide taking place in Gaza, Piers?
Oh,
are
I
there
would
billionaire
say,
Israelis?
I would say it's
that
got
doesn't change the
everything
fact
to
that
do.
Israel's carrying a...
Actually, it's got everything to do with a lot of it. Actually, is that you have a bunch of rich billionaire terrorists leading Hamas, and they're not actually the oppressed people you're trying to paint them as. They are rich terrorists leading a terror group, and they don't even live in Gaza. They don't care about the lives of people in Gaza.
I know that, Piers, I know that I stand on the right side of history by opposing a genocide, and you are an accomplice to it by sitting here and propagandizing
whatever. You
for
can
a
use
terrorist
you can
genocidal
use all that
apartheid
bullshit.
state
You can
of
bullshit
Israel.
that stuff as much as you like, but
Wow, this is incredibly aggressive.
I will give you. I will
guys
give
can
you.
just sit here
I will
and
give
bully
you one.
me, but you're just a bunch of genocide
I'll give you
apologists.
one last chance to just answer a simple question. Do you think what happened on October the 7th was justified? Yes or no?
Do you think Israel's ethnic cleansing and apartheid
Gave
and
you the chance.
segregationist
You're not
policies
going to
and
answer.
ongoing
Thank you all for
genocide?
coming
I'm
on
giving you the chance, and you're not
Thank you
answering
all for
me.
coming on Uncensored. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, there's Rania. Okay. To me, this is a version of... Rania was amazing. Rania handled that the way that somebody should. It's despite what Piers Morgan says about Rania bullshitting and not answering questions, he's actually the bullshitter. It's Piers Morgan who is a bullshit artist and way more inclined to churning it out than Rania Khalek. And effectively, that's what he was doing there, because he doesn't really care about the billionaires of Hamas. He doesn't care about the politics, the political leaders of Palestine. He is forming this gotcha question, or I don't even know if he formed it. A producer gave it to him, and he made sure he ended the show on it. It was one of the questions, I have no doubt, was on a sheet in front of him and available to use during the interview if he felt like it was useful. And so in that moment, the word he heard rattling around in his head was, Rania is telling me the Palestinian people are oppressed. the Palestinian people are oppressed. Okay. I've got a question for you. If they're oppressed, how come Hamas has billionaires who are living outside of Gaza? Man, that'll shut down this debate, right? She won't be able to continue claiming that Israel is oppressing Palestinians and this has to stop, because I'll show her those Hamas billionaires. They're living outside of Gaza, and if there can be billionaires in Hamas, then there must not be the kind of oppression happening in Palestine that this Arab American woman is going on and on about on my show. I mean, it's just fucking ridiculous. And no better than what you heard. I mean, it's in the same genre of questions that younger people had to deal with during the Occupy movement, when someone would come to them and question what they were trying to do and say, well, you're using an iPhone. You've got an iPhone here. And do you know how Apple makes the iPhone? But you're live streaming on an iPhone. So there you go. You don't really have principles of supporting the 99% versus the 1%. You've got an iPhone that you're live streaming. And I know, here you go. Piers Morgan, after listening to a conversation and that he's had repeatedly, he's not actually advancing the conversation with his uncensored debate show. If you tune in, it's kind of like Groundhog Day, where you get the same conversation over and over again, and it's like Crossfire on steroids, and it purports to be facilitating a wide range discussion, but all he's doing is tokenizing people and setting up Arabs and forcing them to condemn certain acts that are already condemned globally. So why should they be brought on and forced to condemn? And then occasionally the Zionists that can't control themselves gets put in their place. Or he had that one valuable clip with an Israeli spokesperson who embarrassed themselves by saying he wasn't authorized to tell Piers how many civilians have been killed by the Israeli military. But with that being said, Hamas billionaires to shut down the defense of Palestinians from being attacked relentlessly in an assault that has no end in sight, and is not accomplishing the military objectives that the officers of the Israeli military forces have set out to accomplish. They are not going to be able to eradicate Hamas. They're not going to be able to remove all Hamas militants. So they are going to be continuously bombing innocent civilians and making Gaza more and more unlivable. And this is the way that Pierce behaves himself. And to a guest, I mean, there's been people on his show that he clearly tires of by the end of the broadcast. But, needless to say, Rania did nothing to get under the skin of Pierce. It was Pierce first who prodded Rania for no good reason. I mean, he knows what she's brought on the show to say and the perspective that she is there to present. And that kind of questioning, sort of like forcing a conversion, there's no value. There's no value in that. But kudos to Rania for going on and standing her ground and not being intimidated, and really was alone, a lone voice for standing in defense of Palestinians. And then that's true. That logically, if there are any Hamas billionaires, as Bungled and Botch points out, what is the U.S. doing? They probably have sanctioned those individuals. I know that there have to be sanctions from the U.S. Treasury Department against Hamas people. So apply sanctions, and then they really don't have access to that wealth anymore, which actually means that then that wealth isn't available to trickle down and serve the people in Palestine. But it's not like they're free to spend that money anyways on anything that would help people in cities in the Palestinian territories or in the Gaza Strip. So this is just Piers being a bullshit artist. And but I had to play that because it is a remarkable clip. That's where we are. That's where we are in the war. These people who are defending genocidal violence have reached the point where they're invoking billionaires in Hamas that may or may not exist in order to justify the killing of children, the extermination of entire families, food not getting there, full-blown famine. They are rationalizing the attacks on Rafah that are happening. And so since they have no way of responding to this, that they can't go back to some of their old talking points. We're now reaching the farce part of their conversation, and they have to make up things like Hamas billionaires. All right, so thank you. I'm going to look and see if there's any other comments before I log off. I'm glad that there were people here to tune in to the broadcast. I believe tomorrow night I'll do a live stream. And I wish that, I think it's We Need Critical Thinking. I could be wrong. But one of the people who tend to follow the broadcast has spoken before about how they'd like more videos about movies and stuff. The great Roger Corman died. I'd like to take some time in the evening on Wednesday to spend a little bit going over what he did and the impact that he left, and also connect it back to what I do, the social political side of this all, because there are some things that I can do. It's interesting. I wrote a little bit about Roger, so I think tomorrow night I'll look for a notification. But let's say about 8 o'clock. Let's say we'll do 8 o'clock Eastern time. 8 o'clock Eastern time. I'll jump on, and I will do a bit of a show, and it won't be as heavy and stuffy as this show. This will be an opportunity to take a little break from what understandably has to be attended to, but is pretty life sapping. I recognize those out there who are trying to keep their heads up and do this regularly, and they're doing far more than I am on this war on Gaza. People like Rania going on that show, it's so great that she goes on that show, but the mental health of people like Rania right now, the burnout, the exhaustion is tremendous. So then to go through and subject themselves to that and then come out after and, wonder, what did I just do for 40 minutes? Okay, yeah, I got myself out there, but did you see how Piers was acting? All right, so here's Gregory. Whoops, we just killed press freedom in front of you. Oh, you didn't see it on that tiny black and white TV. Too bad. Yeah, like I said earlier in the broadcast, that there's overflow rooms that have this tiny monitor that hopefully you can still follow court proceedings. So we'll do the lighter broadcast on Wednesday night, and then there might be a news story or two that I just briefly highlight towards the end. If you come with any questions or comments, I'll, stray away from the thing that gets the broadcast going. Feel free to do that. This is your opportunity. And then I need to do a better job. So, having done this for a couple weeks now, what will happen is if you're a Dissenter subscriber, a paid subscriber, I'm going to send out a link to the broadcasts. I'll let you know what's coming and give you notifications so that you could tune into the live broadcasts. Like otherwise, if you're not subscribed to the Dissenter, then you're at the mercy of the algorithm for YouTube, and sometimes YouTube doesn't push that notification out to people. I realize that there are, I think I've hit 5,000 subscribers. Nice if I could bump that number a little higher. Once it gets to 10,000, I'm allowed to do a fundraiser on this channel, but I don't really need to do it because I have my own way to bring in donations. But the more subscribers, obviously, the better the videos on this channel will do. The notification for the broadcast doesn't always get pushed to people. So I'm trying to make sure everyone knows that I'm going live. I don't do a good job all the time of getting that out. And I don't always know I'm going to do a live broadcast because I have a 7-month-old. And so a lot of my decisions around when I'm going to go live and do these broadcasts, it depends on what I'm able to do around my schedule, taking care of a baby, and also my wife's professional schedule in her job. And so balancing all of that, I then was able to come today and do this broadcast, which was nice to be able to engage with several of you and all of you that tuned into the broadcast. I thank you for supporting and following this work. I recognize many of you, and it's always good to see you tuned into the broadcast. So I'll try and get a schedule formalized. Probably do some kind of alternating, like a Monday, Thursday, and then the next week do like a Tuesday, Wednesday kind of a thing, so that people can get to follow these broadcasts. I can have a wide range of people, and it's never like, oh, he's always going live on Monday. I have a job on Mondays, or I have this meeting on Mondays that I can never get to follow the broadcast, or, oh, he's on in the evening. It's better for me in the afternoon, and vice versa. So these streams are for the people who are the biggest supporters of my work. And ideally, I guess probably should have some kind of like Zoom webinar set up where I could bring people in and they could talk to me and we could have a conversation, and I could, you could introduce yourselves to me. I could introduce myself to you. We could have a conversation about some of these issues and topics that we talk about incessantly on this channel. It just is a little bit cumbersome to set all of that up. Housekeeping items that I didn't want to delay the start of the show with, but it's always good to communicate to people what is going on. I think that the donations that are coming in, there have been, I've been following some of them. I think I'm halfway funded when it comes to hiring a reporter for the upcoming extradition hearing in Julian Assange's case. So thank you for those. And I'll leave with this comment from Teresa. Queen Rania is the very best. Piers is spoiled white brat boy. Rania, we love you. Amazing brilliance. Go Rania. We need you just like that. Kevin, we're going to figure out how to properly support it. And it's been good being here this afternoon with you. Or maybe you're in Europe, another part of the world, and it's getting to be late in the evening. later in the evening. Wherever you might be, I say try to hang in there. I hope you are doing all right, doing as well as can be. And I will be back soon with another broadcast. Thank you.